Thank you to the SIOI, to Dr. Cavelli and his staff, and thank you to the Diplomacy Festival and the organization of today. They invited me to chair this session about critical infrastructure protection and intelligence, which is a very interesting and new topic, said in this way. So we have several speakers today, several guests, very important, and I will introduce briefly each of them, and then we will start following their own speech. They invited me to okay. We have Simon Jones from Belfer Center. He is, by the way, the author of a very interesting report about energy and critical infrastructures. Maybe he will give us some details from that. We have Simon Clayton Mitchell, head of the cyber capability of DG2all. We will have Ardam, we are waiting for him, director of the summer school on critical infrastructure at Venice International University. We have Ekaterina Rudina, senior system analyst from Kaspersky Labs. And we have Maurizio Pollino, who is a staff scientist at INEA, which is the Italian National Agency for Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development. So we will talk about this research and intelligence devoted to help protection of critical infrastructures. What you think about that, how you think and you feel we can use these kind of capabilities for critical infrastructures and not only. I will give the floor, first of all, I suggest to Simon Jones, okay, if you agree. Please, Simon.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me join. As you say, my name is Simon Jones. I'm currently a non-resident fellow with the Belfer Center. I also work for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, running cybersecurity for their Department of Energy and Environmental Affairs. So it's a very relevant topic for me. I just wanted to start by giving some kind of short opening comments. I mean, one, to set the context of cyber attacks and how they're impacting critical infrastructure. You know, it's very clear that cyber attacks are already persistently impacting many sectors. You know, we are seeing electric utility companies impacted. Already, cybersecurity professionals across the world are reporting that they worry that enterprise networks tend to be protected better than critical infrastructure by their cybersecurity efforts. And we already see that cybersecurity professionals are growing increasingly worried about the impact of, you know, kind of national cyber power competition, you know, the notion of a cyber war impacting them. And while 63% of them are seeing them as a threat to their business, only 27% of organizations tend to actually plan or think in these terms. So I think these are really important things to bear in mind as we start to talk about how cyber attacks can potentially affect critical infrastructure. And I'd like to offer you three kind of thoughts, three conclusions that we can draw from some of the research that we pulled together as part of the recent report I co-authored, which is on the National Cyber Power Index by the Belfer Center. Number one, I think it's really important when we're talking about protecting critical infrastructure for us to think about what objectives attackers are trying to pursue. You know, we tend to think a lot in terms of defense and offense in cybersecurity. And I think that's not a particularly helpful way to think, because our research actually showed that 8 objectives are pursued by countries in cyberspace: surveilling and monitoring domestic groups, strengthening and enhancing national cyber defenses, controlling and manipulating the information environment, intelligence gathering and collection, growing national cyber and technical competence, including through commercial espionage, destroying or disabling an adversary's infrastructure and capabilities, defining international cyber norms, and finally amassing wealth and extracting cryptocurrency. And that's really important from a critical infrastructure perspective, because across all of the 16 categories that the US Department of Homeland Security tend to use, it's not just that kind of destructive attack that we see being presented against critical infrastructure. We see cryptocurrency attacks. We see people trying to target the election system to change votes and manipulate voter opinions. And so therefore the techniques, tactics, and procedures that are used to protect against these are different as well. So again, I think it's really important to kind of broaden and increase how we think about cyber attacks and how an attacker might target critical infrastructure. Secondly, I think there's a very clear question about how effectively we use available information. Many cybersecurity teams, many cyber threat intelligence groups within organizations will use commercial off-the-shelf intelligence products. And there's nothing wrong with that. There are some fantastic reports, fantastic products. But I would say that, these organizations are commercially driven and commercially motivated. And that does mean that they are not necessarily thinking in the broad, comprehensive terms we need to think about. So one example, again, is the US 2016 presidential election. A lot of the threat reporting we saw about the kind of information operations pursued by Russia and others would not necessarily have been covered in those commercial threat briefings and reports. And that does mean that there is the potential for us to miss things and have blind spots if we're thinking too much down those lines. So my suggestion is that organizations instead try to think about using their own threat reporting and their own threat monitoring, pulling log data from firewalls, pulling log data from access management systems and inventory systems. Again, it's really a return to basics to make sure we are using that and not just constantly thinking that those commercial reports and those industry specific reports are going to fill the void. And then the final point I'd like to make is we also see in our research an increasing likelihood of countries pursuing active cyber defense measures. Everything from what the UK's GCHQ is doing in terms of protective domain name services, where they're blocking users from hitting certain domain names and stopping domains from being able to spread malicious information, really all the way through to what Russia's doing in terms of its efforts to actually be able to disconnect its domestic internet from the global internet infrastructure. All of these are different methods that can be used to better protect its critical infrastructure. And, just looking at it through that lens, then there are clearly benefits to protecting critical infrastructure. But unfortunately, we are still seeing there are too many instances where countries, companies, organizations are allowing the basics to kind of slip them by. There are unpatched information control systems, SCADA, we still keep seeing that again. We know some of the critical vulnerabilities that have been reported across the last couple of years, things like Heartbleed, still not being patched, still not being addressed. Now, this is not to denigrate or to criticize the information security professionals who are responsible for doing this. But again, the other thing we're seeing is in a lot of countries, there is still not sufficiently high quality information security professionals and also executives who understand exactly what cyber risk amounts to and how to protect against it. So again, we'd really strongly encourage that, we focus on the basics and encourage executives to better understand cyber risk. Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to take questions at your convenience.
Thank you, Simon. Interesting. Now, let's go to, to Simon Mitchell. Mr. Simon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. So my name is Simon Clayton Mitchell, and I'm head of cyber capability for a small UK digital consultancy called Digital. Any response to an event involving critical national infrastructure must first understand the nature of the situation, and the ability to do that depends on the quality of the intelligence that's available. Intelligence starts with raw data from lots of different sources. And the quality of the final intelligence relies on the extent to which you can extract meaningful information and then act upon that at different levels, so local, regional, national, and international. And I would argue that COVID is an example of where governments have sought to tackle a crisis at a national level, communicating using resources within the government that are mainly national, using information that is not sufficiently detailed at the local or regional level. And that has caused increasing conflict with the regions and even local areas that will say, hey, we have better information about what's happening on the ground in our area and influence, but we're not sufficiently involved in the decision-making process. And the challenge with security and critical infrastructure is that an incident can actually be local, but have national or even international consequences because we have increasingly interconnected services and supply chains. So for this conference, I wanted to focus on mainly on cyber risks, and I've selected two different events that illustrate the increasing risks that we face with our critical infrastructure. The first is an event that occurred in February 2008. It's actually very well publicized, and it was when Pakistan Telecom, I'll abbreviate that as PT, Pakistan Telecom, wanted to block a specific YouTube video, as was instructed by the Pakistan government. And the video had been deemed inappropriate, and in order to block access to it, PT advertised their network locally in Pakistan as the shortest internet route to the YouTube IP address. And they did that using the Internet Routing Protocol, Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP. Now, under normal circumstances, each network in the internet maintains a common list of all the IP addresses and instructions on how to get there using BGP. And I describe this as the internet equivalent of, if you're sitting in Pakistan, or you're sitting in Italy, or wherever you are in London, if you want access to YouTube, your network, your network service provider says, I'll pass you on to network 2. Network 2 will then pass you on to network 3. Network 3 will then pass you to network 4, and that's where you can find the YouTube video. And these BGP routing tables have been described as the glue that holds the internet together. They're absolutely critical. They tell all the other networks where anything can be found. Now, in this case, PT, Pakistan Telecom, basically said, you can find the YouTube on my network in Pakistan. So that meant that any of the local internet service providers in Pakistan that wanted to try to connect to YouTube, they would go to PT, and PT would basically send them to a server sitting in a basement somewhere in their network and say, you have tried to access inappropriate content. That was fine locally, but the problem was, inadvertently, Pakistan Telecom advertised that route change upstream to PCCW, and PCCW is a tier 1 ISP. They weren't looking for invalid address advertisements. Why would they? PT was a valued customer. They trusted them. And a check would have been manual. So they broadcast the check. And in effect, what happened was that all attempts to access YouTube globally got routed to Pakistan Telecom, to that router sitting in a basement somewhere. And it in effect shut YouTube down. And despite YouTube's best efforts to get that service back up, the only way that they actually rectified the problem in the end was that PCCW actually disconnected PT from the internet for a period of time to allow all the internet routing tables to stabilize and then reintroduce Pakistan Telecom. Now, a large part of the problem is that the internet was never designed with security in mind, and routing between networks is to a large degree handled using the honor system between providers. It's basically almost on a handshake basis. Each network trusts what the other networks tell it, which works well when it's in everybody's interest to tell the truth. The concern is that should a major network from a foreign power decide to create mischief, it is easy to start advertising false routes to key internet services. And if those bad routes are continually announced by a bad actor, it becomes increasingly difficult to determine which route is the valid one to the proper destination, and the internet actually starts to fragment. The second incident I want to discuss is very topical for us today, is because we're now seeing more of a focus on 5G technology, mobile technology, with the launch of the Apple iPhone 12, which I think was announced last week or a couple of weeks ago. And 5G is going to accelerate the installation of devices that we now connect to the internet, part of what is referred to as the Internet of Things. This includes everything from industrial sensors to CCTVs. It could be the monitor you put in your child's bedroom. It could be a smart meter for your electricity utility. It could be the Amazon Alexa speaker that you put in your kitchen. It could be a smart lock on your door. And the problem is that many of these devices ship to the end user with a default password set up, the expectation being that when you install the IoT device, you change the password to a secure one. So in 2016, a botnet was released into the internet that took advantage of this weakness and directed a distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS attack, at a critical piece of internet infrastructure. For those of you that are not familiar, a botnet is an army of computers that are unwittingly and unknown to their operator basically press ganged into becoming part of an arsenal of internet weapons. They've been infected in some way. For example, you have clicked on an email attachment that you shouldn't, or you visited a malicious website. And that malicious software or malware sits silently on your computer, waiting for the time when an instruction from the botnet's command and control server calls it into action. Then the malware sort of comes to life, hijacks your computer and carries out whatever it was designed to do. In this case, it was designed to flood this domain name server operated by a company called DIN, which at the time turned out to be a single point of failure for a lot of the internet. Now, a DNS server basically resolves the internet name that you type into your browser, for example, amazon.com, into an IP address. And without that, that translation doesn't happen and you can't access large parts of the internet. So the botnet flooded the DIN server with connection requests, and that in effect uses up all of the DIN server memory, and the service eventually collapses, it crashes. And this had an impact on companies ranging from Microsoft and Sony and Amazon to Starbucks, Walgreens, the BBC, the Wall Street Journal. All of these businesses were affected. The outage lasted about 12 hours, and the FBI estimated the total cost of the attack at just over $100 million. What made the attack almost comical was the fact that the perpetrators were a group of students. I think they were all under 21 years of age. And all they were actually interested in doing was disrupting competing computer game servers, which people that play computer games on the internet can rent. And they ran one for a game called Minecraft. And what they wanted to do was they thought, if we can disrupt all the other servers, people will come to our server and rent our service, and that will boost our revenues. I mean, it really was quite comical. The reality was that they were able to do this using a password dictionary of only 62 default passwords, which were found on the internet. And they managed to infect over 600,000 Internet of Thing devices with their botnet. Now, you don't actually need to have a cyber attack to disrupt critical infrastructure. And another case I'll talk very quickly about is the closure of Gatwick Airport outside London, Christmas 2018. There had been sightings of drones over the airfield, these, the small drones with autonomous vehicles, very, very small. They could be the size of a laptop, and they were seen flying over the airfield. And the airport operator decided to shut down the airport pretty much totally for 24 hours, right at Christmas. It was a decision that was criticized. The airport was unable to produce intelligent information about it. They couldn't tell you how many drones were seen. None were ever found. And they really didn't have a very effective response to the situation. And in short, the intelligence was poor. And the airport didn't actually have a proper disaster recovery plan in place to deal with this kind of event. My personal view is that in a very short period of time, we in society have sleepwalked into a situation where the internet has become critical to the functioning of society. And yet it lacks even the most basic security we would want from such an important piece of infrastructure. Going back to the botnet attack, the DIN server I described, that was 3 college students that managed to cause over $100 million worth of damage without even intending to. Additionally, COVID has shown that we're not particularly skilled at managing these types of crises in terms of intelligence gathering and communication at the appropriate levels, especially regionally and internationally. And I don't believe that enough businesses or governments have thought through what we would describe as a minimum viable service capability. In other words, how do you run your business or provide government services if you don't have access to something like the internet? I'll leave you with a final thought. The majority of everyday financial transactions in the developed world today are cashless. If the internet does go down, you can't dispense any cash because you can't check bank balances. You can't buy anything with your cards because there is no network to authorize the transaction, which means in this scenario, a society moves into a state of panic very, very quickly compared with a society which has ready access to cash in their pockets and can actually pay for things. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you again, Simon. I think now Mr. Ergin can give us some ideas that will help us to understand even better what the examples just heard means in terms of impacts on critical infrastructure. Ardam, please.
Hello, thank you. I hope you can hear my voice.
Yes.
So my name is Ardam, and I work as I'm the course coordinator of the Critical Infrastructure Summer Course at Venice International University. It's a course designed for practitioners and academicians and researchers. And many of our staff come from the field, as I do. So we work with business associations, we work with UN agencies, and we work with different entities, with critical infrastructure owners. So one of the things that we realize is that people do not know often that they manage a critical infrastructure until we tell them that they do actually. So I wanted to share with you some basic real case samples and also definitions of how to identify a critical infrastructure and how to model it and what it means in reality. And it may help also connect with the discussion that we're having today. I'm going to share with you with some slides because, visuals is always helpful. The first thing is to understand and to identify what is a critical infrastructure. All countries have their own definitions. I'll be sharing here some definitions from the USA and the UK. And you will see that in many countries, the definition of critical infrastructure is also closely related with the hazard profile that the country is facing. In some countries, natural hazards, earthquakes, floods are more the priority. And in some other countries, terrorist attack, cyber attack, or security issues are higher on the agenda. And what is striking is that the critical infrastructure terminology and the concept is pretty new for everyone. It has no more than 20 years, and for many countries, it has less than 10 years. So it's a new field. The scope is that many countries have identified different sectors. And, this is just to show a comparison between countries, like energy, transport, water, food, health. These are common to all countries, information, communication. And then you have some more specific ones where countries decide to identify or not critical infrastructures. How to know if we have a critical infrastructure or not? There's an easy saying that says, like, if you want to know how long something will last in the future, you need to look at how long it has existed so far. Meaning that things that existed for 200 years, they're much more likely to survive and to live another 100 years than the iPhone 10 or the iPhone 12. So if you look at the Roman system, the road system of the Roman Empire, and it has like well-designed roads, you can then see how some of the roads even came up to today, and they're still used today. So in some systems, you have a nomenclature and a classification system, like A1 for the road of the name of the road, and it starts with the first letter of the alphabet and it has one digit and it's 1. It's kind of important. That helps us to identify in a system. Most of the times, if engineers have designed the system, the nomenclature will tell you a bit what is more critical and what is not. So just to give you a few examples, and every sector obviously has a different nomenclature system. If you look at A1 today, there's I'll never be able to pronounce it properly in Italian, so you'll forgive me for that, but Grande Anulare in Rome, and A1 connects to that, down in the corner, on the right corner, and it leaves the city up north. And the A1, which is a national road in Italy, will connect to the city system for a while and then disconnect from it. So it helps us to understand what is critical, at what point is the infrastructure critical. And in this around Rome, it's not critical for it's critical for the nation, but also for the city of Rome. So you have different actors that are involved. And that's a picture of A1 in normal daytime. Then you have to model it. And we're trying to model critical infrastructure, and by assessing how critical they are. This is an easy scale that is used in the UK, in England. And they identify, based on categories, 5 categories, and they basically say, if it impacts 100,000 people, it's category 3. If it impacts 1 million people, it's category 4. If it impacts 10 million people, it's category 5. So it's an easy way to say how critical is an infrastructure. And that would put into context, like, what type of attack are they susceptible, and what is the impact of these attacks, and how many million of people have been impacted. It is for you to choose if it's impact on life, economy, or essential services. You can play with the parameters. So it's a very modular definition, critical infrastructure. That's why it's easy to use. To give you an example how it's been used in real life, IMPREX is a flagship project of Horizon 2020 in the EU, and it aims at making climate projections for the economy of Europe. They've identified that EU is importing 38% of its water. It depends on in other countries, and they made the innovative methodology of looking at which product do we import to Europe: rice, cotton, peanuts. And they came out with soybeans, that soybeans impact. If soybean imports are impacted, it will disrupt the meat and dairy prices of Europe consumption. So you have a supply chain, and they're able to identify one element, soybean, as being the weak link, because they cannot replace it in Europe's climate. And then they look at where soybeans is imported from to Europe in the other regions, and what is the risk, the climate risk of these regions to not produce soybean enough so that disruption to Europe would be disrupted. So it's an easy case where you see they identify water, climate, the European market, and what is imported to Europe that we cannot produce in Europe. And then it's soybean, and soybean is impacting other supply chains. And they say, where does this soybean come from, and what would be the impact if it's disrupted? And they make the climate scenarios of these regions, not in Europe, where these products are produced. So, these are some quick examples to discuss how it can be applied. And just to end up with some cases from the field, we've done 2 years ago a risk analysis of the port of Mersin, which is in southeast of Turkey, financed by the World Bank. It looks like this. And while we were doing the study, the port got flooded. And people think that the flood looks like that. It's a classical flood and port activities was disrupted. But the idea we were telling them is that this is not a local event. The flood is local, but the port disruption has an impact of 600 kilometers. That's the radius of the port, because shipment comes from 600 kilometers. It's the closest port around. And its impact also Syria and Iraq in their import and export. So these ideas, I hope, help us all as an audience to better identify what a critical infrastructure is. It's basically an asset that when it is disrupted, it has an impact outside of you. It impacts the ecosystem and the connections that you have. Like the example of the port, like the example of soybean. And this is how we identify critical infrastructure. We assess their importance, and then we protect them against cyber attack, against floods, earthquakes, or etc. So these are the pictures of the floods. I think my time is over, so I'll keep it to that. I had some more examples to share, but I will give the floor back to Luisa. Thank you. I hope it was clear.
Thank you, Ardam. Really interesting. Thank you, all of you. So now we pass the floor to Ekaterina. Ekaterina from Kaspersky. She will give us another piece of word. Please, Ekaterina.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ekaterina Rudina, and I'm the analyst from Kaspersky Industrial Control Systems Cyber Emergency Response Team. We call this ICERT, which is the global project of Kaspersky. And we aiming to coordinate the efforts around the computer and cyber security of industrial facility, of industrial Internet of Things, of automation systems vendors, all about industrial Internet of Things. And of course, this also covers the critical infrastructures. We have different teams which do threat research and vulnerability assessment, which do the system analysis, which provides the reports. We do the reports on threat research landscape, and you can find it on our site. So we primarily address the potential and existing threats that target industrial automation systems. And we also work with industrial consortia and standardization organizations. So we know a lot about the current trends in protection of critical infrastructures, and one of the current trends currently is the continuous shifting the focus from cybersecurity to more complex terms like trustworthiness, survivability, dependability, and similar concepts which must characterize the functioning of critical infrastructures. The computer threats and network threats, they may impact the physical aspects, and they may cause the unreliable and unsafe behavior of services. But currently, there is no comprehensive approach to assess the consolidated risks. The risks which emerge when it comes to such complex systems. And actually, this is because the protection of critical infrastructure requires multidisciplinary approach and requires the expertise and experience from different disciplines, from different experts. And this is not the surprise. They define the risks in their own way. So what does it mean? Safety risk means not the same thing as cybersecurity risk. Privacy risks, they are completely different from previous two. And we also have the requirements to the reliability. So we also have the reliability risks, and we use the same word, risk, for everything in this field. But actually, when you check the international standards, when you check the best practices, and when you ask experts with different background, they give the different definitions, and they demonstrate completely different approaches to risks. For example, when we have a computer attack on some facility, this attack has some impact. Probably it ends up with impacting the physical environment, but it just changes some behavior, the behavior of the system. And this is the start of these hazardous situations. This just initiates the hazardous conditions, and this is not the safety risk. but safety risk occurs due to the impact of computer attack. And we must not mix them together. And currently, there is a question how to define such consolidated risks. The experts from different organizations like Industrial Internet Consortium, which is world-leading organization for the security of Internet of Things and Industrial Internet of Things, defines the notion of trustworthiness as comprised by 5 characteristics. First is safety, then security, also there is privacy, reliability, and resilience. And actually, this is not enough to define this notion, but we also need to provide the way of communication for the experts, which can guarantee different aspects for the critical infrastructure. And these experts, they also represented by people from different professions, by different disciplines, by different background, and actually the subtle aspects of this communication between different experts may largely influence the level of trust to the overall reliability, safety, and security and resilience of critical infrastructure. So communication probably now is the most important thing when it comes to the security and impact of security on critical infrastructure. And what is much more important is communication of this technical side to business, because currently when business is asked about the security of something, they just say that this is really important thing. When it comes to the implementation, this becomes just the concern of cost item. So considering security as a concern of a cost item requires some optimization as usual. And when you need to reduce the costs, you will reduce the cost for the unnecessary things. And if you had no attacks on your business, on your industrial facility where you're an owner or another type of stakeholder, you don't believe that this is real. And you start playing this game. In decision-making theory, this is called the game of chicken, you know. The origins of the game in America of 60s, where 2 drivers, teenagers, drive towards each other in a collision course, and one must swerve or both may die in crash. And if one driver swerves and the other does not, the one who swerved is called like chicken. That's the game which we play in protection of our industrial facilities. Because everyone optimizes the costs, relying on some wrong assumptions about the behavior of the other party. The vendors, they believe that owners of industrial facility will provide the isolated environment and will not connect their systems to the internet. So this is completely okay to have some vulnerabilities inside their solutions. And stakeholders, the owners of a facility and engineers at the facility, they rely on the absence of vulnerabilities in this equipment, and they continue doing so, and more parts get involved into this game. So they definitely need some strategy of this brinkmanship just to keep the risks and keep this secure and safe. So we need to develop this cyber threat protection strategy, which is aiming the proper communication of security threats to business. And the wrong path is to go through the threats and through the, stories about the cyber attacks and impact, and this just does not work. We need to propose some approach which relies on known methods, and actually the behavioral approach works good here. For those who just don't know, the behavioral approach, I mean nudge, the approach proposed by Richard Thaler, who is the author of this behavioral economics, which addresses the human biases. And actually behind the security issues, we always have some wrong assumptions, which just the conclusion from some human biases. This is always the human factor. And if we address this with a proper approach, if we apply some decision-making system which describes the business level risks and maps them onto protection strategy and protection measures for cybersecurity, and put this all together with safety risks and reliability risks and the overall context of the system, this will improve the level of protection of our critical infrastructures very much. We approached some aspects of what I described in our work with Industrial Internet Consortium in papers about trustworthiness, about safety issues connected to security, and in our security maturity model published by Industrial Internet Consortium. And we continue working on that, and hopefully this will help an overall improvement of protection of critical infrastructure. So I will be really glad to answer some questions if they appear. And that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Okay, we are waiting now for the staff scientist of INEA, Maurizio Pollino. He has a very strong experience about critical infrastructures in modeling them and also in terms of energy aspects, of course. So, Maurizio, please, floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to the chair for her presentation, her introduction to my work, and of course, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this webinar. In my presentation, I will talk about an approach based on a geospatial decision support system developed at the ENEA. My agency, in order to deal with the critical infrastructure protection against the natural hazards. So during my presentation, I will show you some of the results obtained considering the current development of our platform, and also the future development of the platform called SIPcast. So we started from the following issues, which are related to the critical infrastructure protection, in particular considering the fragmentation of critical infrastructure ownership and management, the threats coming both from natural and anthropic hazards, but also the problems related to the dependencies and the interdependencies in case of failure, and so on and so forth. So amongst the various approach to deal with such issues, we selected an approach based on the development of a spatial decision support system, in which, as you well know, we have a sort of integration between a classical decision support system with a geographic approach, the GIS approach, so that we have a large geodatabase in which a huge amount of geospatial layers are stored, and a series of models and applications in order to deal with some problems related to the monitoring of critical infrastructures, but also to the simulation of natural hazards such as the earthquakes. So, in this perspective, we have released the last version of the SIPcast platform that allows to perform the risk analysis and the forecast of one or more critical infrastructures organized in a specific system, also accounting for dependencies amongst different infrastructures. And we have two different parts. We have an operational module of the SIPcast, which allows to perform risk analysis considering the current situation or the forecast situation in case of, for example, of natural threats coming from heavy rainfalls or other events which are predictable. But we also developed an earthquake simulator in order to face the issues related to the earthquakes, which are very important in the context of our country. So, to summarize, we have a large geodatabase with several geospatial layers, so a huge amount of data to be organized, stored, to be considered in order to query them, suitable to be processed. And by the processing of such data, it is possible to perform a sort of monitoring of the territory, for example, in order to predict natural events, as I said before. After you have, for example, the prediction of potential threats coming from, for instance, from heavy rainfalls or from heavy rainfall or from flood, you can predict the damages to your own critical infrastructure, to the specific assets monitored with a series of geospatial processing called geoprocessing in order to highlight which could be the elements which are interested by the threats. And so this first part is a sort of risk analysis, risk assessment against the natural hazards. So the next part is to take into account also the expected damages into the services coming from failures, and so to take into account the dependency among infrastructures. So the final module will support the CI owner in order to solve the crisis, for example, by minimizing the consequences. Another approach is based on the simulation of earthquakes. In such a way, you can simulate, as I will show in the next slide, you can simulate a synthetic seismic event. So, by simulating this event, it is important to manage a large amount of data, because it is important to have information about the buildings, the infrastructures, every single element of each infrastructure monitored, the specific vulnerabilities, the soil condition, the attenuation law by which it is possible to simulate the shake map propagation after the earthquake, the historical data about the area of interest in terms of previous strong events events which interested the specific zone, and so on. So, taking into account all these data, it is possible to simulate one or more synthetic events in order to produce one or more scenarios in which the end user can have the possible situation in terms of expected damages to the buildings, to the infrastructures, and the consequences on the population, on the dependent infrastructures, and so on. And also talking about large data to be exploited, another capability of our system, which is currently in development, is about the exploitation of data coming from satellite, from Earth observation, and from in situ sensors from the field. It is possible to manage this data in order to provide timely alert for the occurrence of current risks or future risks. For example, considering the Earth observation data, the satellite data, it is possible to monitor in the current situation of the ground in order to obtain information about the potential occurrence of landslides. It is a technique based on interferometric SAR data. And in this case, you have to deal with a large amount of data acquired during different time series from satellite missions, such as Sentinel-1. But also considering data coming from the field, we are currently working on the possibility to introduce also information about the other types of hazards, not only natural hazards, such as pandemic. So in this case, one of the future development of our platform was to consider the pandemic diffusion in a specific area and to correlate it with some specific and critical infrastructures, such as the hospitals or in order to provide this information to the authorities and support their activities also from a geographic point of view, because as we know, the pandemic diffusion is also subjected to specific geographic connection from different points. So this is a rapid overview of our activities in this field. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I leave the floor to Luisa. Thanks again.
Nice, the slide with the cloud of thank you words. Okay, thank you, Maurizio. I knew already some of the things you were telling us, but I think they were very interesting for our audience. So now we have a lot of people with us. We are 125. Most of them are very young, so they are approaching these topics. So please feel free to put your questions. It's question time. You can write on the chat, or otherwise you can just take the microphone and speak. We're waiting for you.
Well, I have a question for Maurizio.
Yes, please.
Yeah, do you address in your platform the domino effects?
Yes. For example, if we consider the case of a flood, interesting some components of an electric network, you can have some cascading effects also on the telecommunication network, because the electric network provides the power to the BTS for the mobile communications. So if you not have the power, you not have the communication, so you will not have phone communication, and also after few hours, typically, you not have the possibility to have also the mobile communication. And you have also to consider that some electric substations are also remote controlled by the BTS, and then you have a sort of loop. No power, no mobile communication, no remote control to the electric substations. So in this case, the electric network operators must send a crew directly in order to fix the outage directly to the substation, because they are not yet not more allowed to perform the remote control. This is a typical example of cascading effect, and this is a typical example of a cascading effect that we have modeled within our platform CPCast by developing a specific module, namely RecSim, a recovery simulator, in which we provide to the CI operator one or more solutions in order to minimize the recovery time in case of flood or in case of earthquake.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's really
You're welcome.
interesting. And the last question, do you consider the cyber factor, the factor of probable cyber attacks on the infrastructure? Because you may consider some scenarios of recovery, and you have your simulator, but does it cover the cyber attacks which are intentional, so you can't deal with probabilities, you deal with some intentional factor?
The cyber attacks are not yet considered in the current version of the platform, but we are working on such aspect in order to integrate it in the next version of the CPCast platform. In this first part, we mainly focused on the natural hazards, also because my scientific background is on geomatics, so I provide my expertise in order to define the basic part of our platform, in which the GIS capability is fundamental. But
Thank you very much.
we will work in the future.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Okay, thank you. Again, we have 3 questions from chat. I read the first one from Valentina Spagnolo. Which are the measures to protect critical infrastructure that you think more efficient? Just a quick view for all of you. I saw the expression of Maurizio and I was already laughing. Please feel free to answer what everybody will.
Let me answer. This actually depends on the threat, and we need a kind of risk analysis or hazard analysis. Actually, these terms, they vary from aspect to aspect. And for cybersecurity, this is threat modeling. For safety, this is hazard analysis. And this is one of the big problems now, how to approach this from different perspectives. When we do threat modeling, for example, we set up the security objectives from some perspective, from the perspective of the government, from the perspective of the system owner, or from the perspective of customer, and they will be different. And the measures which we apply then, they depend on these threats model during this analysis. Similarly to safety and similarly to privacy, and all these aspects and characteristics, they are pretty much subjective. But when it comes to the public safety or to the environmental safety, we have the criteria which are established at the level of the regulator or at the level of international authority like IAEA for nuclear industry, for example. So it depends.
Great. Thank you. So another question from Gian Maria Farnelli, sorry. He thanks the speakers for the enlightening presentations, I agree, and say that he's interested about ongoing UN debate over cybersecurity and militarization of internet. In this regard, do you think that enhancing cooperation among states also as information sharing and risk assessment cooperation similar to the one implemented in the protection of the environment field could prove useful in preventing or responding to cyber attack to critical infrastructures? You can read them on the chat. It's quite long questions.
Take that question initially.
Yeah.
I think one of this, there's been a number of events, and I talked about two of them, but there's been many others which have caused real harm. But I think it's only recently that the first death has been potentially recorded due to a cyber attack. There's concern that a patient in Germany died as a result of a cyber attack. They were being taken to one hospital. There was a cyber attack in the hospital. They had to be routed to another one. And because of the cyber attack, there was a delay in how to route them. And that patient may have died. I think there is a need for international cooperation on this subject, but I think what worries me is it will probably take a catastrophic event of some kind that's related to a cyber attack to really put in place international agreements and controls on cybersecurity. At the moment, I think to some degree it's almost still, yes, it can be, the impact can be very severe, but it's almost still viewed as a nuisance rather than as a catastrophic event, if that makes sense. So we may need to, we may need to face a situation whereby the electric grid in a country is taken down and there's, there's chaos for weeks or something, or, God forbid, months. That's the kind of event that creates the momentum to start getting a greater amount of cooperation between countries on this. And I think one of the things I got from the other speakers is, I come at this from a cyber viewpoint. But you've really got to look at the supply chains, and a cyber attack in one area could have, this domino effect through lots of different other things, which are not cyber related, but you've got disruption in the supply chains, etc. It really could be quite significant. I think if something like that happens, then you'll start to see that sort of momentum internationally on cooperation.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I think I agree with a lot of what Simon says. The problem is around this, unlike the kind of environmental elements, is people are trying to weaponize this at the same time. And so, I think we've got to see it through the lens of what's achievable and what's manageable. So, the various UN initiatives about cybercrime and people like Interpol working collaboratively on that as kind of good steps. you know, the analysis we've done in terms of kind of commercial and industrial espionage and these kind of things are good good steps in the right direction. But I think the idea of having, you know, this kind of information sharing and kind of collaboration around protecting the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure, I just wonder if that's probably a kind of step too far for you know, countries to offer and to share, apart from with their closest allies and partners. And so, like I said, it's that weaponization element to me that makes a big difference.
Okay, thank you. Here we have from Isotta Cortesi a question about the platform Maurizio presented. Is it possible for the platform to be useful for airports, and how?
Yes, it is possible, considering the infrastructures, the ground infrastructures of the airport. For instance, if you consider the Leonardo da Vinci airport of Fiumicino in Rome, you can perform a risk analysis considering the natural hazard related to the flood, because it is located in a specific area prone to floods. And so you can obtain a risk assessment of the parts of the trucks or the buildings interested by a potential flood. But in general, our approach is more related to the ground segment of the infrastructure, not to the part of the traffic control, of course, as you can imagine.
Thank you, Maurizio. I have a question, just one moment, from Marco Braccioli. Considering that an attack creates damage, what is the state of the art for the forensic contribution of an attack to a critical infrastructure? Marco, you put a very important question, because you see, everybody's thinking about forensics. Hey, Katrina, can you help us?
I think nobody can help us with forensic attribution. Yes, because there are some fundamental problems with that. And partially because of these fundamental problems, partially because of the some specific architecture of internet, how internet is designed. This is really hard, and there is no 100% evidences for any attacks. We just can give some thoughts on that. And actually, when someone tries to attribute an attack to some concrete person or state, or I don't know, that's actually requires a lot of explanations, and the devil in details. How trustworthy details are on which the attribution is based. Actually, that is the question. And in every situation, you must go into details, dive in this concrete situation, and consider: do you trust this attribution or not? And this may remain your own opinion.
Okay. Thank you, Katrina. Maybe you saw on the chat there was a question to Ardam already answered. It's very interesting about impacts and the metrics to measure impacts. It's something we work on since a lot of time. So Matteo Taraborelli asked for that. Thank you, Matteo, for the question put, and thank you, Ardam, for the answer. And then we have, I think, the last two questions. First one is from Felice Tufo. The Italian government is providing many incentives to renovate buildings, including the installation of solar panels. Many of these systems are controlled by network control units. While decreasing the criticality of the national energy infrastructures, are we providing the tools for the next generation? No, sorry, the next nationwide, but in case next generation DDoS? Simon and Simon? I'm sorry, but it's perfect to ask for Simon and Simon today.
Sorry, my apologies. I missed the question because the internet cut a little. Would you mind?
Okay. It's about we have incentives to renovate buildings, okay, including also installation of solar panels. Many of these systems are controlled by network control units. And we are decreasing the criticality of the national energy infrastructure, but we are providing the tools for the next nationwide DDoS.
Yeah. I mean, this is the concern that I raised with the 2016 DIN attack. It's not that you can't solve the problem, and in fact, I would argue the problem is probably fairly straightforward for many Internet of Things devices, whether it's solar panels in a new building or your as you move to a smart city and you get more of these sensors. The trouble is that so many different parties are installing equipment. They're not really thinking through the security. There may be gaps in security as to who think, I installed the equipment, but it's not my job to configure it. I'm not worried about the security about it, etc. So I just set it up. It's very easy for things to fall through the crack. And the reality is, as more and more of these devices are connected to the internet, they do provide a security backdoor into networks. And what worries me more is over time, as these networks get built, the vulnerabilities, as the networks become old and legacy, somebody forgets about the devices, you've in effect got this backdoor that somebody's forgotten about that now is sitting out there in critical, not necessarily even critical infrastructure, but just infrastructure in general. These vulnerabilities are sitting out there. Nobody really owns the security for them. And it just increases the number of vulnerabilities and therefore potential, threats that could occur. It is a real concern, and at the moment, I actually looked at this as part of my master's. This attack happened in 2016, and I was investigating this in the last 12 months. These passwords for these devices are still commonly available on the internet. This is a set of problems that still exists today, 4 years later. It hasn't gone away. So, all I can say is, yeah, I agree with the comment. And unless there's a concerted effort for each project which installs IoT connected devices, we're going to have to learn to live with this.
Yeah, if I can just add, again, agree a lot of what Simon says. I do tend to take a slightly more positive view. Buying products from a manufacturer who updates their platform, they keep it patched, they encourage you and push you from using default passwords, taking a kind of comprehensive view where you're logging and managing and monitoring, what you have connected to your network, and you buy platforms capable of doing that, and taking a methodical approach that really ensures it understands cybersecurity risks and threats. These are the kind of measures that people can implement to protect it. So absolutely agree with everything Simon's got to say. But I think, if you start with a cybersecurity mindset, and really from that point that you start scoping your requirements and your purchasing, you can actually already start to mitigate a lot of those threats, before equipment is even installed.
No, I would agree with that. I think that's absolutely correct. I think it can be addressed. It just needs to be thought of up front. Yep.
Okay. Now we have two questions for Ekaterina. I think they will be the last ones. I will put together. They are from Riccardo Pastore and Priscilla Roscioli. Okay, Katrina is answering already.
Yeah.
I don't know, Katrina, if you
Yeah,
wanna.
I can. Yeah, I can do it.
Please tell also the question put together. Okay, because
Yeah.
I didn't read.
So this is about the communication between people at different levels, at C-level and employees. Yes, and this definitely should be done. First, we started for communication for the people which are at C-level. For example, IoT security maturity model proposes the communication between CEO, for example, and CISO or principal engineer. So for technical people, for people with technical background who understand risks, who understand countermeasures and can explain them to the business. In such a way, we address this cost effect analysis which is required for business, and we have defined a framework for such communication which allows for creating the security maturity profile and security maturity target, which describes the optimal profile for security for the particular organization. And then after business has it, the business can check following this target and getting this target maybe explained and visualized with diagrams or spider charts, everything. And at the other side, we have the set of countermeasures and indicators of accomplishment which must be achieved in order to complete the requirements of this internal standard. Actually, this target is the standard for security for some device or for some production line, whatever. So that's it. And actually, yes, we need to elaborate on communications to the lower levels as well. And this is possible because behavioral approach, it works for all people. So what is another question? Sorry, probably.
So it's about human factor.
Oh, what is the role? Yes, the human factor. This is. It determines the cyber attack, and this is the key difference with other hazards. On the one hand, we have human factor as the reason for attack. Some people they make mistakes, and these mistakes may lead to vulnerabilities. If this is the program code, and they may lead to some omissions. They may lead to wrong assumptions made during threat modeling. And on the other hand, this is the intention. We can address the safety issues with some redundancy and diversity. And usually this works. This works when we estimate probabilities and probability of those safety risks. But this usually does not work for security because we have this intention, and the attacker intentionally addresses some issues revealed in systems. And when the attacker has the high motivation, this redundancy and diversity will just not work because there is always the way how to overcome this protection, because the protection is also implemented by people. So the most obvious example is Stuxnet attack. And other APTs, they also confirm this. So this is the answer.
Okay. Thank you very much. I was reading in the meanwhile that Lorenzo Toccacelli was asking something, but he says, okay, it's okay, because Ekaterina already answered through the question put by Ricardo. So thank you very much to all of you for being with us for this interesting session. I think now we have to close. I thank you again the SIOI organization and Sara Cavelli, all the speakers and guests, all my audience for today, and the Diplomacy Festival for this opportunity. Thank you, everybody, and have a good
Ciao Luisa, ciao a tutti.
Grazie, Sara. Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Hello, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Grazie.
Bye bye.
Grazie. Ciao, ciao.